Hey, it is Monday, May 11th, and if you're checking in, we're glad that you're here. As you can see, Steve is distracted with his phone, but the rest of us are here and paying attention. We're trying something a little bit new, a little bit different that we think hopefully will be valuable. You can let us know if that's the case or if it's not. But the goal is to continue our conversations about revival, the concept of revival that we've been preaching about on Sunday, and to extend the conversations into kind of the aspects of daily life. And so we're going to be discussing a topic. It'll be hopefully a relatively short conversation that you can participate in by following along and then responding. If you have some ideas or thoughts to share, feel free to reach out to us at staff at Woodbury Church. So what I'm going to be doing for this coming week is I'll be introducing a topic each day that we want to talk about related to revival. And so today what I want to talk about is this, it's not a book, but well, it is a book. I love collecting books, and I have more books than I probably will ever read. I have books at home. My wife gets a little annoyed, but I still look for books. And I came across this book called The Unsaved Christian by Dean and Sarah. And I didn't buy it because I felt like, man, I got a reading list that's too long anyway. But in the book, he talks about the concept of cultural Christianity. And it really got me thinking about what this idea is. I hadn't really heard the phrase before, and so I started to do a little research about this idea of what it means to be a cultural Christian. And it's actually a phrase that has some definition, and I don't know like if anything jumps out to either of you. But the idea is that our culture still has a lot of trappings of Christianity. So we talked about that a little bit on Sunday. You know, there's still prayer before football games. If you watch the Grammys, it's not going to be surprising to see an award winner thank God for the award, even if the content of their music is pretty questionable. And so it seems like there's like some cultural inertia for Christianity that doesn't necessarily translate into like these different deep aspects of people's lives. I guess I would describe it like momentum. So I think a lot of us, I got to remember to turn off my volume here too. I think a lot of us would kind of understand that there are people who are Christians or consider themselves Christians, but they don't, like, it hasn't really transformed their life. There's not repentance and revival and a real search and a heart for God. It's just sort of like they've grown up. Their grandparents were Christians, mom and dad were Christians. They went to church, you know, once a month or a couple times a year or whatever it is, but they would consider themselves Christians. So I guess I'm curious to hear your reaction to that, because I think that there are a couple of dilemmas that are brought up with that idea. So the verse that comes to mind is 2 Timothy 3:5, where he's talking about false teachers, and he says, they have a form of godliness, but they deny the power thereof. Now, of course, that's a little bit different than cultural Christianity, but that's the idea. People who have some vestiges of Christianity, but aren't really living or following Christ. They haven't made that decision. So how does that strike you? Does that feel like that's a fair assessment?
Well, the first thing I think of, this trappings, it's trappings of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it is that we find Christianity to be a piece of our life, and even maybe a helpful piece or a valuable piece, but it's just a piece that, we put up on the shelf, and then when we feel like we need it, maybe we take it down, or maybe we speak to it, then, and that's not what following Jesus should be.
Yeah.
I think to kind of build off what Steve is saying is that with Christianity being kind of ingrained in our culture, at least to the point that people are familiar with Christian language, to use some of these phrases that we use in churches, people use that just kind of on their daily lives. And so that's not completely odd for them to understand. But I think because of that, and because Christianity is just so inflated in our culture, it's just another piece of the pie, that it loses some of its significance when it's, you're comparing your Christianity as long with sports fandom or your political aspirations, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, speaking of politics, I think a lot of Christians struggle with conflating their views of politics and their Christianity. And so sometimes one should inform the other, but we got to be really careful about the other informing our faith. Um, I've heard a lot of missionaries talk about this sense that when they go on the mission field, that it's almost easier to engage with people about Christianity who have no relationship to it, because you're not trying to dismantle some assumptions they have about themselves. You're just, they are Hindu or Buddhist, or they don't consider themselves Christian. And I imagine it's much more difficult to try to evangelize someone who thinks they're Christian. It's like I don't know, this sounds a little pejorative, so I apologize beforehand, but it's like people have inoculated themselves with kind of a dime store version of Christianity, and so that they're not open to the real thing because they think they have the real thing. But it's like I don't know, aspartame versus real sugar. It's a poor substitute, and I think it makes it hard for us as ministers to reach out to people because they don't see themselves as lost.
I can identify with that because on the mission field, many of the groups I've dealt with, and even among people here, when they decide to follow Christ, it is going to be vastly different. They can't do it halfway. Their culture just won't allow them to. And yet here, when we're got these trappings of Christianity in our culture, then it seems easier for us to just do a taste of that or a piece of that and not fully devote ourselves to the Lord. And that becomes a big negative.
Yeah. Well, here's a question then that I think is important for us, but maybe important for people tuning in, is how do we gain a sense of self-awareness about the elements of cultural Christianity in our own lives? So where we're relying on our spiritual inertia, so to speak, and we're not actually intentionally choosing to follow Christ. How do we gain a sense of awareness about that?
You go, Caleb.
Well, I think, I can really kind of speak from my personal account. And I think a lot of that is kind of looking to the history and seeing kind of Christianity's role in our culture. And because I think, as America, more or less being founded as a Christian nation, a lot of those ideals were intermixed within this American revolutionary ideal, which has shaped our culture and shaped us. We're this mixture of ideals and aspirations.
Yeah, and in reality too, like the whole idea of the American Revolution, it kind of goes against the teachings of like Paul in Romans 13, obey the governing authorities, which I'm not opposed to being an American or the American Revolution, but it is kind of funny that the fundamental idea is not really a biblical one.
Yeah, and so I think, at least for me, one of the ways that we can go about creating some self-awareness with and understanding our role as Christians in our culture and how we can differentiate that or, find some renewed depth to it is looking to history. And I'm a little bit of a history buff, but I remember studying the early church and how they were a persecuted group, struggling and being persecuted with death and in secret. And all of a sudden, Emperor Constantine, on his, thinks that the cross and thinks that if he worships Jesus, that will bring him victory in battle. So he, displays a flag with a cross. He wins that war, and he decides this Christian God is onto something, and makes all of Rome Christian. And so all of a sudden, this Christianity that was this underground movement, struggling, became at the forefront and really lost a lot of its direction and purpose. And I remember when I first studied that, I was able to kind of look at the Christianity of our culture and just like, there are so many similarities. And that for me was one of those first moments where I was able to be able to take a step back and to create some awareness about what does Christianity actually look like in culture and what should it look like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I've lived twice as much history as Caleb has. So, but I was thinking about this morning. So speaking to the self-awareness part. So I don't know so much. I wasn't thinking about our culture as much as I was just thinking generally about revival.
Yeah.
There's got to be a self-awareness, there's self-realization part that how I live my Christian life is not measured by culture.
Yeah.
It's not measured by what everybody else in America is doing around me. It is, again, the standard is following Jesus, what I see people doing in the New Testament. And so that brings a different self-awareness. And I had this thought, it's almost like this morning, just again, revival in general, it's almost like we need to see ourselves as a loaf of bread that has maybe become a little moldy or stale. And so we've got to pick off those pieces that have been that way, and then we're good again. But that takes some self-awareness.
Yeah. Spoken like a true missionary. I mean, I think most Americans would just throw away the entire loaf of bread. Well, we don't have a ton of time left, but because we're trying to keep these conversations manageable, because I'm sure they could go on for a long time. But I did kind of want to ask one other question, because I think that there's a danger of Christians continually raising the bar, so to speak, on what it means to be a Christian. I know that I have experience in Christian environments where whatever somebody else was doing wasn't good enough, and you just figured out why it wasn't good enough to differentiate yourself from them. So it was this constant kind of like judgmentalism where, that church, they sing too many songs. Well, that church doesn't sing enough songs. Well, that church, the preacher doesn't wear a tie. Well, that church he does, and he's just proud of wearing a tie. And it's just like this constant way of like casting aspersions on everybody else. And I think the goal is to differentiate oneself like from everyone else, to kind of find what makes, to have a sense of like Christianity, and we're different and we're distinct, come out and be separate. But it's done at the expense of being judgmental. And it really creates a standard that maybe it's not really about following Christ. It's about like, how am I better than someone else? Have you guys experienced that approach to differentiating oneself from other Christians or from the culture?
Yeah. I remember, this was back in college when I would try to engage with non-Christians, and I would be talking to them, and they'd kind of find out they're Christian because, they're from Arkansas and they're familiar. They would kind of like, oh, you're a Christian. My first response was, yeah, but I'm not that kind of Christian.
Right.
Like I wear my Hawaiian shirts to church, just trying to like, I'm a casual, easy to talk to Christian that you can actually, and that was my way of like, I'm differentiating myself from a group that you might maybe you think of as hostile or just, whatever you think of. And so I've been there before, just like, yeah, I'm not that type.
Yeah. We're not defining ourselves by Christ. We're defining ourselves by how we're different than either these other Christians or from our culture. And I think that can lead to all kinds of strange ways of engaging with our faith and strange standards.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned raising the bar. So I don't feel like it. I feel like two things. I need to raise the bar for myself.
Yeah.
I don't need to raise the bar for other people at all. I think we've probably all heard these stories about a new Christian who comes into church and then maybe either does something wrong or says something wrong that's not culturally appropriate with the church, because we've got these Christians and they're brand new to it. Well, they're not held by the same standard. They're growing, they're young, and so I think that the judgmentalism should not be there at all. And if we're talking about raising the bar, we should be, again, it's a self-awareness thing, holding ourselves more accountable, to give grace to everyone else.
We compare ourselves to Christ. It's not about anybody else. Well, guys, we're out of time for today. Steve, you and I are both in our offices, but we're practicing social distancing. So that's why we're coming at you via video. And Caleb, of course, you're at home. We're hopefully going, if this works well, we're going to be bringing you conversations each day. Tomorrow we want to talk about sort of the opportunity for revival during the stay-at-home orders, that there is an upside to the shutdown. And so we'll be talking about that tomorrow. If this has been helpful, let us know. If it hasn't been helpful, keep your opinions to yourself. So we will we'll talk to you guys